Hello everyone. Well, this is a turn up for the books, isn't it? Strange music, different editing voice, but the reasons for all this will become apparent in a minute. Some of you will probably recognise my voice. I'm Peter Jarvis, once your very occasional legal correspondent, and I've made one or two contributions since then. But I'm going to play you now an interview which, without any rehearsal or pre-arrangement, I had about 10 days ago, and I'm hoping that you'll find this a substitute for your usual magazine which will really interest you. I'm very fortunate today in having the opportunity of putting questions to someone we've all heard over a number of years. I've known him in committee for 15 or more years. Our editor of the magazine, Mr. Ian Seth. And like me, you've probably heard him from time to time and thought, well, now that sounds an interesting sort of chap. I bet he's been around a bit and had an interesting life. But like me, in spite of having 15 years or more committee, you haven't had the opportunity of talking to him and asking him what he's done and where he's been. So here is our opportunity, and I'm very happy to be able to say good afternoon, Ian. And,
good afternoon.
And now to begin to ask him, well now, where did you start from then? What part of the world were you born in, and what sort of a family did you come from?
Well, I was born in 1920 in a little village on the Firth of Forth in Scotland called Gillen, next to Muirfield Golf Course, and it's a golfing centre. And my grandfather was the station master at Gillen, who paraded up and down in a top hat and frock coat in those days.
Great.
But my father was sent to Australia before the First World War because of some illness, and he needed to go to a hot, dry climate, and he went to West Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And came back to this country for when the First World War broke out, and served in Gallipoli and so on. And then after the war he married and had a hankering to go back to Australia.
Mm.
So in 1926, with wife and 3 children, he went back to Australia.
And how old were you then?
And I was then 5.
Ah, yes.
And my younger brother and an older sister.
Ah, yeah.
And I was educated in Australia, and I stayed there until I was 18.
Goodness. And so you were used from the beginning to being a Pommy, more or less, or perhaps
Well,
they didn't have Pommies.
I have no recollection of much about Scotland or anywhere else at that time.
No.
I was too young, but my sister has memories of my grandparents, but I don't.
No.
And when I was 18, about 1938, my father decided that he was going to send my brother back to Britain to be trained as an electrical engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a hankering to join the army.
Mm-hmm.
And so he suggested that I should go back, and that was the time when Hall Belisha was the Minister of War.
Yeah.
And had a great scheme that he was going to recruit from a wider area for officers in the army than just the public schools.
Uh-huh.
And I was caught up in this kind of idea.
Mm.
And I'm very glad that I did come across in 1938, otherwise I should have ended up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp or somewhere like that, because I was light age to have gone to Malaya,
My goodness, yeah.
to Singapore and so on.
Mm.
So I came back to this country with my brother in 1938, and I joined the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders to pursue a military career, and of course within 12 months I was caught up in the last World War with the British Expeditionary Force. In October 1939 I was across in France, and of course was caught up in the great battles of Dunkirk and all that, and was taken prisoner in Dunkirk, or was outside Dunkirk, defending Dunkirk I was sort of part of the contingent which tried to keep the Germans at bay while everybody else got away.
Yeah.
And
Very true.
so I spent the next 5 or 6 years as a prisoner of war in Poland, in coal mines and things like that.
In Poland?
Mm-hmm.
Good heavens. So you know all about this coal we're importing now. What sort of a time did you have there? I mean, for goodness sake, that must have been rather a hard life, wasn't it?
Well, yes, I suppose so, but we lived on hope the war would be finished, by Christmas, but each succeeding Christmas came and nothing happened.
Mm.
So it went on, and I remember being in a Silesian prisoner of war camp on the Czechoslovakian border almost, and hearing a voice over the radio in the camp saying that D-Day had started. One could hear the guns firing over the air from Dunkirk, from the D-Day landings from Normandy. And then we knew that it had started. So, yeah, but I spent most of the time as a prisoner of war as an interpreter. I spoke German to a certain extent, and I was able to work as an interpreter. You had to do some kind of work, so and the only officers were excluded or excused working.
You didn't have to actually mine the Polish coal then?
Oh yes, I spent. Even though I was an interpreter, I also there was nothing to do. So while the time away, I'd used a pick and shovel. I dug coal in soft coal mines and hard coal mines, and did our best to sabotage the German war effort.
Jolly good. Did you have any...
Putting trucks on the wrong rails and things like that, therefore causing all kinds of havoc.
Great. Did you have any interesting escape stories or anything like that? You did, I presume you'd be too far away from the point of getting access to Allied troops to make it worth your while to try and escape.
Well, a lot of people did escape. One of the problems of being an interpreter is that, of course, that you're the first person that's missed, because as soon as someone goes missing, the first person they call for is the interpreter, in order to find out, to talk to the person in charge of the camp, find out what had gone on. There were lots of attempted escapes. We were once ensconced in a Franco-Prussian fort, the Franco-Prussian War. They built these huge forts along the Polish-German border, and the one I was in was at Poznan, now Posen, the Germans called it, and it was almost impossible to get out. But people used to hide in the carts that took the rubbish out and tipped out on the rubbish tip outside, and then waited until dark, and then crawled out of the rubbish tip to try and make their way. The kinds of stories you hear and have had films made of are mostly officers who, spent their time tunneling out of camps. We didn't have to tunnel out of camps because we went out of camps to work. And we might travel 50 miles to work. And if you could escape from there, you had a 50-mile start. By the time they got back and were counted, and there was one short, you were already 50-odd miles away. So we never had to go to all this trouble of digging tunnels and that kind of stuff. Nonsense. But so a lot of people tried to escape. A lot of people got caught.
Yes.
A lot of people did get away.
Did you find it difficult to stay Polish? I mean, emotionally or otherwise, or?
Well, I'm not a person who panics or worries unduly. I accept things what they are and make the best of them. Some people, actually became totally mentally unbalanced. Other people had it a much harder time. The interesting thing was that when the Americans started to come into camps as prisoners, they were the people who suffered more than anybody else. Mainly because they live on such a rich diet that when they went on to a starvation diet, which we had of 100 grams of bread and a bowl of soup a day, they were the ones that faded away to skeletons quite quickly.
Good heavens,
The whole things were quite extraordinary. I mean, camps varied from one to another. I've met all sorts of people who were prisoners in various parts of Germany, people in the Navy, the Air Force, and if you listen to them, you'd think they were entirely different countries, entirely different lifestyles they lived. Well, one or two occasions when I was at risk from people who were unstable.
Really?
When I worked in the mines in Silesia,
Yeah.
the people who ran the mines were people who were what were called Folkdeutsch.
Oh.
They were Germans, they were Czechoslovakians or Poles, who had one parent or grandparent who was German, and therefore they were given the status of being Folkdeutsch, which meant they were not quite German, but they weren't quite Untermenschen either.
Yeah.
And they were very hard.
Really?
And they had no real sense of responsibility for the people working down in the mines.
No.
You could be abandoned to be killed in the mine by an accident, because they would never tell you that anything was going to happen.
Good heavens.
As we were amateurs of the whole business and never been down mines before, we weren't aware of the risks, but they used to run away if they heard something happening and leave you there without telling you to. And I remember one occasion I had to acting as interpreter. I was remonstrating with one of these Folkdeutsch foremen.
Yeah.
And he grabbed his pistol out of his thing and marched me to down the tunnel away from all the others shouting and screaming that I was being insolent and all that.
Yeah.
But what he did eventually was stick me in the lift at the other end and send me up to the surface. But it was, for a few minutes I thought that any minute he might shoot me. But
yeah. Nasty. Oh.
I had a period with the SS.
Yeah.
Who were knocking down a Polish monastery, and they wanted all the bricks cleaned and stacked for reuse, and our job was to knock the monastery down and clean the bricks. And they said to us, well, you can go out and work all day when you come back and be fed. And the British, true to their kind of trade union experience, did a bargain, or tried to do a bargain with the German SS by saying, can we have a fixed number of bricks per day, and can we come back when we're finished? And they fixed the rate at 300, I think, per person. You see, well, by 1:30 in the afternoon, they'd done their 300 bricks, and so they demanded to go back into the camp. And so the Germans came back the next day and said, well, that won't do, we'll up it to 500. And so it went on. You see, that there was no way you could win. But,
No.
But the SS were quite extraordinary. And, I've heard all sorts of tales about them, but they were scrupulously fair.
Were they? Yes.
In the sense that they said to me, you tell these people that your colleagues, that if they behave like soldiers, we will behave like soldiers to them. Mm-hmm. And they did. They parade everybody and sort the tattered clothing they were wearing. They ordered the army tailors to repair everything, and boots were repaired and clothing was repaired. They said, well, now you're reasonably comfortably clothed and housed, you then have to do your work.
Yeah.
But they were also adamant that they were the SS, and you had to do what you were told when you were told, and to exactly their terms. And I remember when occasionally we used to get Red Cross parcels came from Britain.
Oh yeah.
Which contained, bits of soap and tea and meat and coffee and chocolate, things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
They were few and far between, but when they did come, the Germans, of course, were very suspicious of these parcels, because they thought, well, these tins of goods and dry goods can be stored and be kept to help sustain people when they escaped.
Yes, yes.
So they said, well, in that case, before you get anything, we must open all the tins.
Oh, my hat.
And we must open all the packets and tip them out of the containers. And so that the first thing they did was to give you a large bowl, and then they tipped tea and cocoa and coffee and custard and soup all into the same bowl. So none of it was any use to anybody. You couldn't eat it after that, and you couldn't use the stuff. And I remember one very superior high-ranking German officer coming to say that he would supervise the opening of all this material, and he had it all laid out on tables, and we were all paraded to watch. And this very tall officer, well over 6'6", beautiful white uniform, came striding up, was given a spike on a handle. He whacked it through the top of the tins, covered himself with tomato soup. It never happened again. There were these kind of funny incidents, you see, that occasionally lightened affairs.
Oh, yeah.
But
God, yeah.
the whole thing we were much better off in one sense in our treatment than the Japanese prisoners of war.
Yes.
Because at least we were soldiers, and it wasn't in the philosophy of Western soldiers of any nation to consider it a disgrace to be captured.
No, quite.
Whereas in the East it was thought to be a disgrace.
Yes,
and therefore you should have
indeed.
actually killed yourself
Yes.
rather than be taken prisoner. Therefore you were less than human.
Yeah.
But by contrast, you see the civilian population in Poland, the Germans regarded as Untermenschen, and therefore, as they were less than human, they could be treated in any kind of way.
Ah.
And the upshot of the SS and the Polish monastery business was that they got fed up having to allow us recreational periods and to keep the Geneva Convention and deal with all this food parcels and things, that they got rid of us. They sent us back, and they got Russians, so they got Russians instead whom they could starve and beat and do what they liked with, because they had no Geneva Convention to worry about.
Yeah. You eventually then didn't get out of prison, do I gather, until the end of the war?
Not until 1940, 45.
Yeah. And were you sort of rescued or something? I mean,
Well, I should say one thing about 1944, when the Germans were very hard pressed in Russia.
Yeah.
They tried to recruit British soldiers to fight the Russians. They tried to get all people like me who could speak some German were rounded up in a camp in Berlin and subjected to a sort of soft regime of propaganda and privileges. And I've got photographs of all these things, whole piles of them.
Wonderful.
And I can remember we used to get lectures from people from Berlin University who tried to persuade us that of the economic benefits of living under Hitler and all that. The people who ran the camp were British soldiers from Queen Victoria's Rifles, and they were nearly all people who were adherents of Oswald Mosley,
Really?
and therefore were fascist in their outlook.
Good. Oh.
And we were given this treatment for about a month, and then offered the opportunity to join the German army and to wear a Union Jack on the sleeve to show that we were British members of the German army, and to go to the East Front to fight the Russians. But of course, most of us turned it down.
Some of you didn't then.
Well, I assume some people did, but I didn't know anybody who did. But
No.
the program went on. I remember we were taken on to excursions to Berlin. You know, I went to Sanssouci, Frederick the Great's palace, on one occasion, and when we were coming back, we were standing on the S-Bahn, and the train came in, and it was, of course, as usual, packed, and people were thrown off by German soldiers so that they could get on.
Really? Yeah.
And I was on the train, and I was thrown off the train by some German soldier so that he could get on.
Yeah.
And I was just standing there on the platform. The train had gone, and the guards and all had gone with them. And some German officer came up and tapped me on the shoulder, and I was wearing battle dress. You know.
Yeah.
He said, "And what part of the German army do you belong to?" And I said, "Well, I don't belong to the German army." And I got on to the next S-Bahn and train that came in and followed the group to the next station. But anyway, in 1945, after D-Day and all that, and the Americans would come up through Austria, we were in eastern Poland, and we were marched out of eastern Poland into Czechoslovakia.
Oh, yeah.
And we marched the whole length of Czechoslovakia during the winter to get away from the Russians, or to get away from anybody. But the Germans they were getting away, the Germans were getting away from the Russians, but they had to take us with them, because they didn't want to abandon us, so they just took us with them.
Doesn't sound a very comfortable journey.
It was terrible, and a lot of people got frostbite and so on. We were, it was inches deep in snow and very heavy frost.
Yeah.
And we were not suitably clothed. We slept in barns and that kind of thing.
Good.
Eventually we came out of Czechoslovakia into Germany at Regensburg, and where we sat back into the Americans.
Ah.
And one morning we woke up and the German guards had gone, and we were literally free.
Almost your surprise.
Yes. So I went into Regensburg, and there was a truck going to Paris with the Americans. So they offered me a lift. So I found myself in Paris with an American unit, and they flew me back to Great Missenden several days later, but I had a very lucky escape, because when I was in Paris I injured my foot.
Oh.
And it was only a blister, but it was a double blister apparently, and the under blister was septic.
Oh dear.
And I was feeling very groggy, and I was on my way to the plane.
Yeah.
And I called in at this medical centre just to get it dressed.
Yeah.
And they put me into hospital, and I was on antibiotic penicillin for days.
Oh really?
Apparently it was all touch and go, and then when after that was over, I came back to Great Missenden.
Would this be a legacy of your trip across Czechoslovakia?
Yes, presumably it was.
Yeah,
but,
so really your escaping or your being released from prison was in a sense the period when you were most at risk. In the sense that...
Well, yes, I suppose so, in that physical sense. Anyway, at the end of all that experience, I came back and I went back into the army. And the curious thing was that I was put into the Education Corps and asked if I would lecture to ex-Japanese prisoners of war about what happened during the war.
Good heavens.
And of course I had no idea what happened during the war. Apart from what I knew from, I knew it was as if I had been living in Britain all the time and could tell them.
Quite extraordinary situation. So then, you were in the army, and this, I presume, lasted until the end of the war. What happened after that? I presume, you hadn't actually done, I take it, any training for any specific sort of occupation before you went into the army at the beginning of the war. What happened?
No, well, I had, during my years in some camps, noticed that a lot of people were unable to read. There was a literacy problem amongst soldiers. And people used to take books out of the library and sit pretending to read, even if they're upside down, they wouldn't know. And I began to take one or two of these people in hand to teach them to read. And I discovered that I had a kind of vocation to teach. And when I was demobbed in 1946, I went to live in Edinburgh with some relatives, and I began to try to find out what it is I'd like to do. And I then applied to do teacher training. under the emergency teacher training scheme.
Yeah.
And I was interviewed and accepted, and I was offered either an emergency training scheme in Kirkby and Liverpool, or I could have gone for a standard training course for teachers in Nelson Hall. One was 2 years and one was 1 year, so I chose the 1 year course and went to Kirkby and Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, while I was waiting to go to this course, because I had about a 6-month wait at the beginning of the year, I joined TOC H
Oh my goodness.
in Edinburgh. And one of the tasks, you know, TOC H give people social tasks to do, and one of the things I was asked to do, whether I would interest myself in the Boys Brigade. And I formed a Boys Brigade company in an approved school.
Oh, splendid.
And after 2 years, that sort of petered out, in the sense that it wasn't the kind of thing those particular kinds of boys wanted to do.
No.
So I then formed a company in the Pleasance in Edinburgh, which is a settlement run by the Church of Scotland, the sort of slum area. I ran this company with my brother and became an elder of the Church of Scotland.
Good heavens. Really?
And
well, was that you had obviously been, you were a member of the Church of Scotland, I take it,
oh yes,
from the start.
My mother's father was a minister of the Church of Scotland.
Oh, I see, yeah.
He had a parish in a little place called Dallas, from whence a villager went to America and founded the Dallas that we know about so much.
Good.
And my grandfather was the minister of Dallas from 1863 till 1924.
My goodness, that's quite a record, isn't it?
I have been, yes, I have lots of things, and I have his original communion service in pewter, which he used in his church, which was part of it, which they gave me kindly.
Good heavens.
And I've been to his church many times, of course, now in the north of Scotland. It's up near Forres.
Really?
But so there are those kind of interconnections. But I became an elder of the Church of Scotland, and then I had to come to England for a training course for teaching. And having completed that course, my first job was in the Black Country, in a little place called Willen Hall, which is...
We know about Willen Hall.
Willen Hall, don't you?
Yes, but
and
when you... I'm terribly sorry, but when you say you became an elder of the Church of Scotland just before you left Scotland, does that mean that having left Scotland you ceased to fulfill that function, or is that...
Yes, well, I could have become... you see, I was an elder of a particular church.
Yeah.
Although I was transferred, on a piece of paper, I could take my membership of the Church of Scotland to a Presbyterian church in England, I suppose.
Yeah.
But in fact, I'm not particularly wedded to any particular branch of the faith, so to speak.
No.
There were some things about the Church of Scotland I didn't approve.
I see.
The fact that elders of the Church of Scotland used to deliver little cards inviting parishioners to come to communion, and without one you couldn't get in. And I didn't think that was a thing that we should be involved in, really. But that was the Church of Scotland. And when I came to Willen Hall, I continued with the Boys Brigade. I founded a Boys Brigade in the local Baptist church.
Oh, yeah.
And I was there for about 2 years.
Really? Yeah.
And then I married in 1951, and we lived in Birmingham for about 6 months, and then I went to the Isle of Wight.
Goodness. Oh, yeah.
To Ventnor.
Really? Yes.
And all the time I was interested really in working with handicapped children, with less able children with learning difficulties.
Oh, yes.
And somebody asked me once, because you know, by profession I'm a psychologist.
Yes.
Asked me how I came to go from, being a teacher of religious education to psychology. And I said, well, mainly because teaching underprivileged children, I began to want to understand how it was that they had difficulties in learning.
Of course, yes.
And therefore I had to start to study the psychology of learning.
Ah, yes.
And I went then to Birmingham University to study the psychology of learning.
This is after you'd been in Ventnor, is
Oh
it?
yes, I mean was in Ventnor for, well, I was in Ventnor for 4 years.
Yes, I see.
And then
Teaching handicapped children.
well, I was teaching in a secondary school, but I was teaching the less able children
I
in
see.
that school.
Yes. Mm.
Now, I have to diverse slightly because my wife's sister
Yeah.
is married to my cousin.
Oh, yes.
He is a doctor,
Yes.
and they had gone to Australia to the Flying Doctor Service.
Good heavens.
And they persuaded us that the place to be was in Australia. And of course, you know, I was educated in
Yes.
Australia, and I went back to Brisbane at their behest. And but that's another tale. I went to Australia. Took my family to Australia in 1956 from Ventnor,
Yeah.
and I taught there in what was called an opportunity school, which was again for handicapped children, but more severely handicapped than I'd been used to. There were less able children, but there were also children who were hyperactive and who were physically handicapped as well as mentally handicapped.
Really? Yeah.
And after a year there, for family reasons, and nothing to do with me particularly, but for family reasons, we came back to this country.
So that was, what,
In
about a
1957.
couple of years in
And
Australia?
In a year. We were back in a year.
Yes.
And I came back to Birmingham
Oh, yeah.
because an uncle of my wife's uncle, who had been working with somebody in a school in Raddlebarn,
Yeah.
had been saying I was on my way back, and this headmaster asked him to ask me if I'd go and join his staff to look after the less able children in his school,
Yeah.
which I did.
Yeah.
And of course, from 1957 to 1960,
Mm-hmm.
I worked in that school looking after the less able children.
Yes.
And it was from there I went to Birmingham University to train in psychology of
psychology.
childhood and so on, and learning.
How long were you there then, in Birmingham University?
Well, I did that's a year's course I did in Birmingham
Oh,
University.
I see, yes. Yes.
And then when I came out of that, I went into the school psychological service,
Oh, yeah.
where my job was to go around schools testing for and identifying less able children and their problems, and training teachers, their own teachers, to cope with remedial courses for particular difficulties.
Oh, yeah.
And I ran training courses for teachers at weekends and other times until, well, for about two or 3 years.
Yeah.
In 1963,
Yeah.
I applied to. I was asked if I would go and go into teacher training in West Hill College
To teach in teacher training.
to
Yeah.
teach
Yeah.
psychology
Yeah.
of learning and so on.
Yeah.
To train teachers in training,
Yeah.
and especially to run courses for teachers for handicapped children, teaching reading and things like that,
Yeah.
which I did for the next 20 years.
My goodness. Yeah.
And in 1967 I went to Aston University to do a master's degree in experimental psychology and counselling and things like that.
Yes. Which you got with flying colours, no doubt.
Yes.
Great.
And I continued doing it until I retired in 1982.
1982. So you've been retired now 11 years.
Yeah, well, I retired early. Well, I was only 62. So.
Yeah, like me. But having retired, you haven't ceased to be active at all.
Well, in 1981, when I was still in West Hill, I was asked to start the Talking newspaper.
Yes.
And we started up the South edition in 1981.
I was a little, I'd said 15 years, but it's obviously about 12 years then that you've been doing this.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is my 13th year now.
Yeah.
And I'm on my 620th magazine.
Goodness. That's quite an quite an effort. And did you have any previous? Surely you must have had some experience in tape recordings and this sort of thing before.
I was always interested in technology, but and when I was in West Hill, I was in charge of technology.
Oh yeah.
And I used to run courses on. I taught television and radio courses.
Yeah.
For using television and radio for teaching purposes
Oh,
for
yeah.
handicapped children.
largely because you were interested in it.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and I built up the whole of the educational technology section of the college before I retired.
Splendid. Oh well. So they obviously were very happy to let you continue to use their technology base as the talking newspaper.
Yes, and when I retired, they offered us the use of the building to go on doing it because they felt that they wanted to be concerned in doing something for the community,
Splendid.
being a Christian college.
Yes, that's right.
And they've this year written to say, with under the new principles, they were willing to continue to let us use the building.
So we have an indefinite base
We
there.
have an indefinite base, which we get free of charge.
Well, I hope you'll be able to continue operating on our behalf there for a long while still to come. And this year, of course, or rather from the end of last year, you've now, having had 12 years running the South, you now become chairman of the whole of the Birmingham organisation.
Yeah.
Which I must say,
until we find a permanent chairman. We're now looking for a new coordinator.
Yes, now you're running the administrative part of the South. I would imagine you've quite enough to do with the talking newspaper. It's a full-time job, more or less, is it?
Mm-hmm. Well.
Well, do you still have any connections with the Church of Scotland then?
Not directly, no, because I'm not really an institutionalized Christian.
No, you're not really an organisation man, sort of thing.
No,
No.
I don't feel that I have to. There are far too many man-made restrictions in the church organisation.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I remember in the Isle of Wight wanting to take communion in the local church, and the vicar said, or the rector said, "You'll have to get permission from the Bishop of Portsmouth," which I thought was nonsense. So I thanked him very much, and didn't.
No.
When I came to live in Bourneville, the then vicar of Bourneville said, "You can come and take communion in my church. No one needs to know anything about it." I said, "Well, that's equally dishonest. I don't belong to any organised church body now, really.
No.
My son is a lay reader of the Church of England. And
Yes.
my sister-in-law is a minister of the of the Reformed Church.
Oh, yeah.
My nephew is a minister of the Reformed Church.
Goodness. Well, you've a lot of family connections.
Oh yes,
family,
sure.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
at one time, I might even become a minister myself. If things had gone differently, or different opportunities had opened themselves up.
But certainly during the course of your life, you've obviously had plenty of opportunities of doing things which have been vocationally satisfying, I imagine. I'm sure.
Oh,
do
yes.
Do you not feel that...
I'm very privileged to have done, I have had as my work, my career, so to speak, something I enjoyed doing.
Yes, that's marvellous. Absolutely splendid.
Very rewarding.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And you've gone on. Well, I must say it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to have the opportunity of talking to you like this. And it's a great thing after all these years to have discovered. I had no idea about your having had all these prisoner of war experiences and so on. Great privilege to have found out a little bit more about you anyway. And very many thanks.
Well, thank you for listening to me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have finding out a bit more about our editor of the magazine, Ian Seth, and I hope you'll agree with me that after 620 odd editions he's entitled to have one to himself. Anyway, it's been very nice editing the magazine for once, and now I wish you all the very best, and goodbye for now. The music you've heard, incidentally, which is going on in the background now, is Eric Coates' Everyday Suite, played by the BBC Concert Orchestra under Ashley Lawrence, and I'll let that play us out.
And now here is your quiz. Can you name 4